Hello, this is the voice of Stewart Pearce, and welcome to Deep Dialogues, a series of vital conversations that I have with global soul stewards from all over the world who provide us with an understanding of how we can create a new hierarchy of values that is absolutely significant at this unique time of becoming. I hope you enjoy, and thanks for listening. Having technical hitches, but we're now here, and I'm sitting here. I'm Stewart Pearce, the host of Deep Dialogues, and welcome to everybody who's here. Unfortunately, I can't see your comments in the chat box through this new StreamYard system that we're using, but I'm sitting with the wonderful Steve Taylor. So welcome, Steve. I'd love to share with everybody a little bit of your bio, so that they have a context for this wonderful man that's sitting before us.
Thank you,
Steve Taylor. Sorry?
I just said thank you. Nice to be with you.
Bless you. So Steve Taylor is a senior lecturer in psychology at Leeds Beckett University and author of several best-selling books concerning the interface between psychology and spirituality. He is the chair of transpersonal psychology at the British Psychological Society, and his 13 books include titles such as Waking from Sleep, Out of the Darkness, Back to Sanity, The Calm Center, and The Clear Light. Indeed, the latter book, Clear Light, gained a testament from Eckhart Tolle, who wrote the foreword for Steve's book. And Steve lives with his wife and children in Manchester and regularly appears in the media, writing or speaking about this wonderful métier of his. So Steve, welcome.
Thank you, Stuart. Great to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
It's great to have you here and to hear your perspective on this time of extraordinary becoming as we go through into this new cosmic cycle, having just begun a new 13,000-year cycle. And of course, now we're no longer dawning Aquarius, we're literally in Aquarius. And there's a dispute over that, of course, because we're talking about the colossal spheres that move in their own timing sequences. So there's a little bit of controversy over it. But you know, what we were talking about in our pre-show chat about the nature of Jupiter and Saturn meeting on December the 21st, that was a really powerful portal opening. And I think everybody of any sensitivity will agree that there was a shift in their process. So I'd love to know, where did it all begin? Where did your interest in psychology, and then particularly in transpersonal psychology, where did it begin?
It began when I was about 16 years old. And it wasn't conscious. It was something which was inside me. Back then, when I was a teenager, I had what I would now call spiritual experiences, although I didn't understand them at the time. They were experiences in which I would feel a sense of connection to my surroundings. The world would seem to become illuminated around me. Everything would look incredibly beautiful and real. And I'd look at the sky and feel somehow that I was part of it, that my being was somehow sort of flowing into the sky. And I felt that the trees were sentient beings and the moon seemed to be a sentient entity. But at the time, I thought it was a bit crazy. I thought there was something wrong with me. So it took me many years, several years, until I began to understand myself and realize I wasn't crazy after all. Or maybe I was, but it wasn't maybe a bad thing to be crazy. It was actually a good thing to be a bit crazy. So
what was the point of illumination that brought you to a rationalization of the transcendent nature of what you've just described to us?
It was a slow process. It probably began to change when I was about 23 years old. By chance, I discovered a book on mysticism in a bookshop. It was called Mysticism, A Study and an Anthology by a guy called F.C. Happold. It was kind of like a scholarly study of mystical experiences. So I bought the book. I felt an impulse to buy the book. And I recognized my own experiences. I thought, wow, you know, other people have had these experiences. And the book had extracts from the Upanishads and from other spiritual texts, from the Tao Te Ching. And I thought, wow, you know, I feel so connected to these texts. I recognize my own experiences. So it opened up, reading that book opened up a whole new realm of spirituality to me. You know, I began to meditate. I began to go to meetings of spiritual groups. So I had a sense of suddenly feeling at home, you know, suddenly understanding myself. And even more importantly, suddenly accepting myself, you know, feeling that I wasn't a weirdo after all. I was actually I was a spiritual person who was following a spiritual journey.
Mm. And the perspective of this is unusual, you've used the words crazy or weird. Presumably that they arose because of the social context that you found yourself placed in, that there weren't necessarily rampant beliefs about transcendental spirituality.
No, not at all. Not in my background. So I didn't have a religious background. My family, that we weren't atheists, but we just weren't really interested in religion. Although my father, for him, football was religion. Manchester United was his religion, but that wasn't really spiritually. That didn't really offer me much spiritual sustenance. So yeah, it was partly an environmental thing. Maybe if I'd been born into a religious family, maybe I would have understood those experiences in some religious context. Or even better, if I'd been born into a spiritual family, a family who were interested in spirituality, then I would have made sense of those experiences. But I think it's, I think very few people, I don't know about your background, but I find that very few people are actually born into the kind of environment when they can make sense of these experiences. Did you go through a similar process, in your background?
I was aware from the very beginning. I mean, the way that you were sharing with us that nature of interconnectivity, I was aware from the very beginning. I've always seen it. I've always felt it, and was very aware of the supernatural world. I had a slightly unusual childhood because my father worked for the British royal family and was a high-ranking servant. So we lived within grace and favor, which meant that we were very akin to the history, the tradition, and the heritage of monarchy. So we, for example, I was brought up in St. James's, very close to St. James's Palace. In fact, the first 5 years we were in St. James's Palace. So these are very old buildings filled with art treasures, filled with memory of bygone periods. And I was alive to this energy. I saw force. So I saw dead people. My experience, a little bit like the Sixth Sense movie. I saw spirit, I saw angels, I saw elementals. At the same time, that life was very balanced because my mother wanted my brother and I to have a very balanced, very earthed situation because we were very isolated in that state of privilege. So we went to state schools. And when I went into state schools, I found the cruelty of some of the behavior bewildering. And so I really ostracized myself from that situation. But also I had profound learning difficulties. I couldn't read, and I'm numerically dyslexic, very profoundly so. I think today probably we would have diagnosed my state as borderline autism. So I stayed in connection with the world of wonder, as I called it, up until about 10 years of age. And then life intervened. Life became too painful. Acute hypersensitivity, others would call social malfunction and so forth. So I didn't really tune in until my 27th year, and it was when my mother died. And that was a big rite of passage because I nursed her through cancer for a year. And when she died, my third eye opened and she came to me and spoke to me. And so I've been awake really since 1979. That's when that happened. So slightly different experience. But constantly steeped in religious processes. I found the ritual and the theater of the litany just mouth-droppingly wondrous. I mean, I found that it gave me huge security and safety, whereas 3D was often very, very much in turmoil. However, back to you, because many of the people who are listening know me very well.
I'm more interested in you than me.
Oh, bless you. And I'm more interested in the unique insights that you have. And I know that you also have poetry because you're a keen poet and you write beautifully. In fact, the
Thank you.
way that I was introduced to you about 5 or 6 years ago in Orlando, Florida, was somebody who was a great believer in your verse and actually introduced me to one of your anthologies. That's how I became aware of you. And then, of
Oh,
course,
right.
looked you up. So,
Oh,
I
excellent.
apropos what we're sharing, which is really about an initiation, an awakening, a conscious rationalization of the unseen worlds, or a belief in unity consciousness. I don't know if you have any poetry that expresses.
Yeah, let me just have a quick look at my book. I'll read a poem called "At One with Your Body." And it's really a meditation. It's about sort of using the body as a way of meditating. And I think I wrote this because some spiritually minded people occasionally have issues with the body. You know, there's a tradition in spirituality of kind of denigrating the body, seeing the body as something less valuable than the spirit or the soul, for example. Seeing, you know, some people think in terms of a duality between body and soul, and somehow that the body is, you know, something slightly not unclean, but something slightly of a lower status than the spirit or soul. But my perspective has always been that the body is sacred. It's the body is an expression of spirit, and essentially there's not really any duality between the body and spirit. They're both expressions of spirit, so they can't be different. You know, they are one and the same. So this is a poem based on that idea, and it's really, as I say, a kind of meditation. It's called "At One with Your Body." Lie down in silence. Uncenter yourself from your restless mind. Let your attention spread slowly through your body. Feel your skeleton and skin until you are one with them. Feel the gentle breathing of your lungs and the beating of your heart and the flowing of your blood until your attention merges with them. Rest inside your body. Let your limbs lie loose without pressure to move. Let your face lie expressionless without agitation. Let your ears and eyes be dormant without reaching out to perceive the world. And when you are at one with your body, you can also be at one with your mind. As your breathing slows down, your thoughts will slow down too. As your body lies still, your mind will become still too. After all, mind and body aren't separate entities. They're telepathically attuned, like twins, who feel each other's pain and joy. And when your whole being is at rest, you'll sense a subtle spiritual essence glowing softly like evening sunlight through every atom of your limbs and veins and skin, and through the endless radiant space of your consciousness, from a source beyond both body and mind.
Wow. That's beautiful. It's a contemplation in itself. It's a meditation in itself, isn't it? So as you speak it, the way that you weave your words, the fabric of that metaphoric consciousness that you create really does open up space, not just within, but also without. So I feel suddenly that we're engaging in the portal into the transcendental. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
So you're a priest of the word, aren't you?
I guess so. Yeah, I've always been aware of the connection between spirituality and poetry. You know, there are so many wonderful spiritual poets like William Wordsworth, William Blake, Walt Whitman in America, and in every country in the world. You know, there's this wonderful connection between spirituality and poetry. I think maybe it's because spirituality often goes beyond normal language. It goes beyond the kind of grammatical structures and the dualities of normal language, beyond the tenses of normal language. So you have to move into poetry, which is, which gives you more room to express the inexpressible. And maybe you can, I think in poetry, you can convey the inexpressible through, through rhythm and metaphor and sound and so on. So it's beautiful.
I'm absolutely with you. Poetry has always been immensely alive in my life, as you probably gathered, because I trained actors for 40 years, up until about 10 years ago. And most of my work was actually within the classics, was in teaching Shakespeare. And in order for the actor's voice to really open up, rather like a classical singer learning aria, learning repertoire, to flexibilize the voice, to muscularly open the voice, and thereby also the imagination. One of the great things that I did for many, many years was to teach the metaphysics, the metaphysical poets. And moving into some of the contemporary writers, particularly at the turn of the 20th century. So yes, absolutely. Edith Sitwell said that all poetry is nothing but a suppressed scream. It's a cry from the depths of sorrow, a de profundis. And so it stirs us very, very deeply.
Yeah, but it's also an expression of joy. It's a sort of a cry of joy, from the transcendent.
Yeah. So a whisper of, or a cry from beyond, into alerting the human form about the wonder of its perfection.
Yeah, I think music has a similar role as well.
And so poetry has always provided you with a great deal of succor.
Yes. As particularly in my younger years, when I was quite confused, and I was very depressed, actually, very alienated and very depressed for a number of years. So during those times, especially poets like Wordsworth, Shelley, I used to love the romantic. I still love the romantic poets. They were a great source of joy and consolation for me. And when I understood my own spiritual experiences better, then I recognized those experiences in people like Wordsworth and Shelley. I love Wordsworth, even though he can seem a little bit kind of sterile sometimes. His language is sometimes a bit dry, occasionally. But, he has descriptions, he has passages where he describes the most profound spiritual experiences. And I think a great poet, when he or she describes an experience, you can re-experience it through the words. You can glimpse that experience yourself. So, poetry is alive. In its truest sense, it conveys spiritual experience.
And yet, I absolutely concur. And that I found over the years that poetry exists in most people on a very deep level. I'm just thinking about my grandfather, who was a Norfolk farmer, and not an educated man, but was one of the wisest men that I've ever met, and was a man of the soil. But he would constantly speak poetry. He would read Keats and Wordsworth, Shelley, Byron. I mean, she walks in beauty like a night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meets in her aspect and her eyes. He would speak to me when I was very, very young in the fields, when he showed me the fairy rings. And I believe that he was actually, he was really talking about Titania. He was really talking about the Queen of the Fairies. She walks in beauty, which is by Byron.
Right.
So as you then matured, you discovered a way of being able to rationalize, because the difficulty is that the academic or the intellectual mind gets in the way of the flow of feeling, because the fact that word music is really vibration, and the vibration of word, that the deep atavistic onomatopoeic sense of a word is the vehicle that can open up, as we know, through great music, great poetry, and particularly with great voices. It reminds me of of that wonderful poem by Walt Whitman, of what is it in me that makes me tremble so at voices? Wherever I hear the great voice, let me follow this being to the ends of the earth. In one of his, and obviously at that time when he was writing, it was really before the cacophony of noise that we know in our industrial society today, which has stopped us from hearing the innate wisdom within the vibration of words. Because most people just live in their heads, so they actually make sound in their heads like this. And I mean, America is really, really strong. You know what I'm saying? And what that does is it irons out vowel, and the vowel is the conveyor of the feeling. Ow, 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 rather than oh, oh, you know. So it's difficult to express the vibrational music. But I'm sort of very intrigued by the way that therefore you decide with this great passion for feeling and finding ways of being able to understand yourself through depression. You know, there may be many people who are listening in who have also experienced depression. I know I have. But for you, was it clinical depression, or was this a term that you gave to it yourself?
At the time, I didn't really understand it. I just felt miserable and sad. But in retrospect, it probably was a severe kind of depression. It was a kind of depression where I couldn't get out of bed until the afternoon. I often thought about, you know, committing suicide. In a kind of, you know, not seriously, but it was often in my mind. I was sort of fantasized about the idea of committing suicide. And it was a feeling of being unable to function in the world. I couldn't speak to other people, you know, apart from it was very difficult to just go into shops and, you know, ask for cigarettes. I used to smoke in those days, or buy food. You know, it was very difficult to hold a conversation with anybody. I only felt comfortable when I was on my own, so I avoided other people's company. And as a result of that, I was more and more uneasy in other people's company until I became completely isolated. I would go days at a time without speaking to anybody apart from shopkeepers. And I just kind of withdrew more and more. I was at university, but I stopped going to my lectures. I kind of cut myself off from the people who had been my friends. And you know, I think there was a kind of a spiritual impulse in it too, because I wanted to make my life as simple as possible. I wanted to kind of reduce my life to the simplest state. So I lived without possessions. I even went through a kind of ascetic phase when I would sleep on the floor in a sleeping bag rather than the bed. I would kind of have the windows wide open in the winter, and, you know, without any heating on, because I'd like the feeling of being cold. So I think there was some kind of ascetic spiritual impulse in there to try to make my life to kind of reduce myself to the most essential state in order to find out who I really was. But it was a very difficult phase. It took me a long time to climb out of it. But in some ways, you know, it was, you know, I feel as though I learned a lot through sort of stripping myself down to the most basic state and reaching that point of deep depression. I kind of, you know, it gave me a kind of a foundation in a strange way that I always, you know, ever since then, I don't think I've ever been depressed since then. You know, I'm always in a fairly happy state, fairly contented state. I always appreciate my life. I appreciate everybody in my life. I appreciate the fact of being alive. So I feel as though I have this deep-rooted gratitude for life itself, which maybe is partly related to going right down to the bottom like that. Yeah, I mean, you said you'd had experience of depression too. You know, did you react to it in a similar way?
Yes, and you see, I feel that it was an interior transcendental experience, that we were trying to pare away all of the dross of the world, all of the superficie of the world, all of the cravings of the world, all of the hypocrisy of the world. Because I always had the ability to see people empathically. I could read them through their field. I could read them through their voices. And it seemed that there was so much disparity between who they truly were and what they were being in the world. Today we refer to as being, you know, the overriding ego that believes itself to be cast within an ivory tower. So I really moved away from that. But also, I mean, I just perceived the world as being a very cruel space because I was constantly being beaten because of not being able to function, academically speaking. And I was against a brother. You see, my brother was academically very brilliant. So they couldn't understand why I couldn't read. I didn't read until I was about 14, successfully. I learned to read through singing. So I closed down and went into this interior space, which we refer to as being depression. So the energy was depressed and we were non-expressive, which is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
But you know, as you describe it, it's almost as though you were moving into, you called it ascetic. I think you pronounced it ascetic. This ascetic impulse, rather like a Trappist monk, doing away with all of the material purely and simply because it was unnecessary, not through any vanity or explosive, exploitative behaviors to do with the fact that it didn't matter. It was just simply, let's get as pure as possible. So we're deep in to discover what are we really all about? You know, what is this? What is this feeling?
Yeah, I think it was a process of stripping myself down to try to find the core of my being.
Yes.
Because, you know, obviously everybody is conditioned by their environment to a large degree. You know, especially when you're younger, you carry your environmental influences throughout your mind, throughout your being. And at some point you have to sort of release yourself, let go of those environmental influences. You have to decondition yourself, especially if you have a spiritual impulse inside you. Unless you're in a society which supports spiritual awakening, which most societies don't, you have to decondition yourself in order to reach the core, the spiritual core of your being. So I think, you know, every spiritual person has to go through that. They have to, you know, reject the consensus reality and find a new reality which is rooted in their essential being.
Yes, and I mean, it's referred to by many of the great mystics as being a form of spiritual madness, which of course we know that, for example, in medieval Europe, because I speak Europe because we're Western, the monks and the nuns, they knew about this. So they would just simply take you in to sanctuary and hold you while one spiraled into what we're seeing as being a spiritual madness, which appears socially to be chaotic and maladroit and possibly misanthropic or sociopathic, in the sense of moving away from meaningful relationships. Because as far as we're concerned, those relationships, although they may be blood ties or love ties, that they're simply not significant, that we want to go deeper and deeper and deeper. So, you know, the point was that then you found ways of being able to function and express and deliver a new symphony in life, where you then discovered the power of the intellect to define, to rationalize the territory. Because what's interesting is that you moved into, I mean, this is a crude definition, but you moved more into academia than moving into, for example, becoming a Shaolin monk or becoming a Cistercian monk. You went into academia. So what was the choice there?
Well, it wasn't really a choice. I always had this strong spiritual impulse inside me, but I was always a little bit of an intellectual as well. You know, I loved philosophy. I was always interested in psychology. I always loved reading, you know, heavy books about philosophy and psychology and so on. But I never connected these intellectual interests with my spirituality. They were always a little bit kind of distinct from one another, as if there were two sides of my being. But years later, I mean, this didn't happen until I was 37. I learned about a field called transpersonal psychology. It was through reading a book by Ken Wilber. It was the first time I'd ever heard the term transpersonal psychology. Ken Wilber is a transpersonal psychologist. I thought, wow, what is transpersonal psychology? So I found out about transpersonal psychology, and I thought, hey, this is me. This is exactly where I can sit. This is exactly where I can feel at home. It was the investigation of spirituality from a psychological point of view. It was basically a kind of intellectual understanding of spiritual experiences and spiritual transformative experiences. And that's exactly what I was interested in, because I'd been having these spiritual experiences for a long time, and it took me a while to understand them. But I began to read about similar experiences, and I began to think about, why do these experiences come? Why do I have these experiences sometimes, and they fade away, and then suddenly they emerge again, and other people have these experiences too. Why do other people have them? I started to think about, what are the different situations when these experiences occur? What are the different states of mind that give rise to these experiences? I realized that the experiences are linked to nature, for example. I realized that they're linked to music. I realized that they can be associated with sex, for example. So I wanted to sort of research this more. I wanted to find out how we can understand these experiences with a view to making them our normal experience. I thought that if I have these experiences sometimes, why can't I have them all the time? Why can't that be my normal state? And so I realized that transpersonal psychology, investigated Buddhism and Taoism and yoga, Vedanta, and so on. And so I began to kind of delve into the world of transpersonal psychology. I did a master's degree, then a PhD. And the more research I did, the more I thought, wow, this is so interesting. I'm finding out so many new things about spirituality and spiritual experiences. I began to do research on experiences of permanent transformation that were rooted in intense suffering. For example, people who have transformational experiences after bereavement, or following a diagnosis of cancer, or following a period of addiction. It's not uncommon for people to shift into a new identity, a new spiritually awakened identity after these experiences. So I just delved into it more and more and did more and more research. So for me, the research I do is the most important aspects of it, researching people's transformational experiences. And, the world of academia can be quite dry, but, I kind of keep away from the mainstream world of academia. I'm kind of on the fringes of where psychology meets spirituality, where the kind of, the dry intellectual aspects of academia merge into the joy and freedom of spiritual experiences. So I'm trying to sort of integrate them, really.
And having mentioned what you've just done about the dryness of academia, do you feel that, because you've been an academic for a number of years now, do you feel that there's a changing temperature in the sense of people are becoming more flexible or more aware of or less doubtful of?
I do, yeah, because I used to think that academics in general were very materialistic, in the sense of being very attached to the materialistic view of reality. I used to think that academics believed that psi phenomena cannot exist. They didn't believe in life after death. They believed that everything can be explained in terms of brain chemistry or brain functioning. So I was surprised that I thought I would be seen as a kind of renegade academic, a kind of that I thought that I may be ridiculed by other academics for my kind of spiritual views and my interest in the paranormal. But no, it's not been like that. I've been surprised at the relatively low amount of resistance I've found in academia. But I think that has changed. I mean, I've been involved in academia for maybe 12, 13 years now. But when I speak to people who've been involved for longer, they say that it has changed over the last 20 years, that people have become more open to unusual experiences and more and less skeptical, about spirituality or about esoteric experiences. Obviously, there's a section of the mainstream academic world which is very skeptical. But I think in the UK, at least, there is more openness than there used to be, which is great.
Things are really shifting. Yes, certainly it's been my own experience as well in being a very overt spiritual witness in my work. And it's true that much of my work was with the education of the young actor, or indeed helping professional actors as they began to find how to live the fullness of what I used to refer to as being how to make borrowed words credible, how to be completely natural in highly unnatural situations, meaning that you are making love to somebody on a stage, but it's public because you're actually doing it in front of 1,600 people. How are you able to access the same level of intimacy and privacy or sensuality, and at the same time communicate this to a much larger group of people? So I mean, I've said to great actors, you're nothing but a truth merchant. They often immediately come back with ribald and say, no, we're professional liars. I think actors will do that because they're always trying to either condone themselves or put themselves down. They're immensely sensitive beings. However, wherever one goes, you see, I do believe fundamentally the way that you've experienced your own journey of interfacing this evidently very detailed and agile mental body that you have with your spirituality, which you've been able to fit very beautifully into psychology and now transpersonal psychology. I do believe that this was something that, I mean, dare I say, it's rather fanciful, but I believe that you were actually doing it in past lives, but you were doing it within monastic community. I believe that all the great monasteries were situations of intense learning, intense philosophical debate. And this took place in all the major faiths, because I mean, we know within Shul, within Kabbalah, there was the discussion and the dissertation of all the varying principles, marrying the physical and the metaphysical body. It's just within the quantification of our world, it became challenging. I mean, if I go back 30 years ago, I remember being asked to leave rooms because I mentioned the word soul when I was in a formal meeting, or emotional intelligence. Oh, for God's sake, Stewart, stop talking about emotional intelligence. There's no such thing. This sort of thing. And now, of course, particularly after the bold attempts of people like yourself and Deepak and Eckhart and Daniel Goleman's great book about emotional intelligence, that it's much more acceptable. And so I'm being seen to be less of an unusual being, even in the corporate world. Oh, I understand that you see angels. Some people say, like, when in Rome, do as the Romans. So I don't talk about it extensively. But it is, again, there are so many different parallel experiences or parallel timelines in our consciousness that it's very interesting, drawing on the richness of what Renaissance thought can bring into exploring what the truth of a situation is all about, of how we can go into the very presence of the holy instant and find out what the mind of God is all about within our own human consciousness. That I find fascinating. But I remember during our pre-show chat that you shared how you were engaged in experimentation, social experimentation, of interviewing people, for example, that have been through unusual out-of-body states. And I think you mentioned also that you'd been part of a survey into near-death experience.
Well, I have done research on people who've reported near-death experiences. I'm mainly interested in the transformational aspects. For me, near-death experiences are incredibly fascinating, both because of their content, because of what they suggest about the afterlife, or what they suggest about reality, what reality is. And I think they're fascinating because they can't be explained. There are so many materialistic attempts to explain near-death experiences, whether it's through anoxia or psychedelic chemicals in the brain, depersonalization, and so on. But all of them, none of them have any validity. All of them can be easily kind of argued against. But for me, the most interesting aspect of near-death experiences is their transformational effect. It's amazing that an experience which may last a few seconds or a few minutes, it can change a person for the rest of their lives. It can change them in an incredibly fundamental way, to the point that they feel that they are living a new life. They feel that they are a new person living the same body. But it's not just near-death experiences. A lot of people have that experience after a diagnosis of cancer, after a bereavement. In fact, I've just recently done a research project on people who report spiritual awakening following a bereavement. And that was really fascinating because it's not an unusual experience. I think it's because when you lose a loved one, everything changes. the world that you thought was stable and permanent is suddenly, broken to pieces. So the world looks completely different. Everything that you thought you could rely on, everything that you thought was permanent is totally evaporates. So suddenly you have to reconstruct the world from a new viewpoint. And for a lot of people, that involves a shift into a new identity. It's almost as if their normal ego breaks down because of the loss of their loved one and everything that entails about their reality. Their normal ego seems to dissolve away. And in that process of dissolution, a new self seems to emerge inside them. It's almost as if there is a latent higher self inside them which was waiting to be born, but it could only emerge once the old ego was dismantled. So that's what happens. This new self rises inside them. And suddenly, they are a new person living in the same body, a new person living in a new world. And sometimes it's not an easy experience. Sometimes it feels confusing. Sometimes they need to integrate their new self. And it takes a while for that integration process to occur. So it can sometimes be years before they become fully integrated into this new self. But but despite the confusion, despite the disturbances which may sometimes occur, eventually, even if it takes years, they do attain a state of integration. And when that happens, they're living in a spiritually awakened state, effectively. So it's I've researched some really remarkable stories. People have been really severe addicts for a long time, alcoholics, heroin addicts. People have been severely addicted for many years, and they reach the point where they've lost everything. Everything about their lives has dissolved away. Everything about their identity has dissolved away. And at the point when there is nothing left, when they are completely broken down, then this miracle occurs, the birth of a new identity. And suddenly they are free of the addiction because the new self, which is born inside them, doesn't carry any addictions. The addictions died away with their old ego. So they're in this strange state of suddenly being free of addiction. And they find it really difficult to understand that, I was a drug addict. Where's my addiction gone? But suddenly, miraculously, it's disappeared. So I'm interested in those transformational experiences, partly because they have a kind of evolutionary aspect to them. To me, they suggest that there is this kind of latent higher self within the human race as a whole, which is slowly emerging. It takes the old ego to break down for this new self to emerge. But my feeling is that it's happening in more and more people. That there is this kind of latent, spiritually awakened self within the collective being of the human race, which is slowly making itself manifest.
I absolutely concur. Yes, because really I feel what we're talking about is the extraordinary, infinitely unfolding creative possibility that lies within death and rebirth, or death and resurrection, that we see happening in the stories of the great mystics, whichever faith or culture that they've been involved in. The idea of dying to the old self and being reborn to, as you were saying, this higher level of consciousness. I suppose the interesting idea to posit is that other consciousness literally dormant within the individual all the time, or is some form of shape-shifting taking place? Because we know that when we go through a death, we lose everything. I suppose in many ways I have also had a near-death experience when I was caught in a really difficult situation on the London Underground late at night, which was desolate. And a young man, an Afro-Caribbean young man, decided that he found me quite objectionable. And so he was very, very big and tall. He started to attack me because of something that he thought I'd done. And he literally grabbed hold of my neck and lifted me up, and a knife was at my neck, and I saw the whole of my life go in front of me. And I knew that I had a choice. So the space-time continuum distorted, and I knew that the choice was that I could either yield to his destruction of me, or I could dig deep within my body and find as much grace as I could as a gift to him. And I chose the latter. And so I dug deep, and this voice came out of me, which simply looked him in the eyes and said, I am so sorry. Please, can I help you with this? And the knife came away, and I don't want your pity. And so I said it again. And this time it was almost as though it shook him, and he dropped me. And I realized in that moment that nobody had ever honored his anger. So I remember a feeling of the Holy Spirit coming into me. I felt that everything about me was washed clean, and that I had done something extraordinary for a brother.
Wow.
And that he walked away and was a changed being, you know, that suddenly his rage had purpose, whereas before it hadn't. And I always remember reminding myself of the Dylan Thomas poem, Rage, rage against the dying of the light, you know, that he wrote when his father died. So that, anyway, it was a transcendental experience. I didn't lose consciousness, literally. I didn't pass out. I didn't die in the conventional sense, but something within me did, utterly. So I'm just wondering, you know, in your experience of, as you annotate so many of the research programs that you've been through, and particularly, you know, writing as you do, firstly your dissertation, then going into your PhD, presumably another dissertation, and then writing books, that if you've discovered how people melt within to have revealed something that has already been within them, but it's much greater and more pure.
I think in some cases it's always been there, but they've repressed it. You know, it goes back to what we were saying earlier about, you know, living in a society which does not support or encourage spiritual awakening. So I think a lot of people are kind of innately spiritually awakened, but they suppress it because it's not socially acceptable. Maybe they're afraid of showing their true selves. So that transformational experience can be a breaking down of the suppression of the walls, of the barriers that they've erected around their true self. But I mean, the interesting thing is that, you know, everybody goes through trauma at some point in their lives. Everybody suffers these kinds of cataclysmic experiences. You know, everybody has a bereavement. A lot of people suffer from depression, intense stress. A lot of people have diagnoses of cancer at some point. But not everybody goes through this process of transformation. Even though these experiences are fairly common, you know, they're not the norm. Most people do not have these experiences. So the question I was thinking, you know, I was asking myself is, why do some people have these experiences, whereas others don't? I think one reason is that some people do have this kind of evolutionary, this higher self, which is developed within them, which is kind of ready to emerge, but has not manifested itself yet. It's like a structure. It's like a chick which is ready to hatch from an egg, but it hasn't had the opportunity. I think the old ego, the normal ego, the kind of socially constructed ego, is stopping it from emerging. So you have to wait for the socially constructed ego to fade away, and then the egg hatches, the chick hatches. So maybe in other people, you know, that they're not quite ready. That new self has not formed itself completely yet. It's still in a process of kind of constructing itself. But I do think that, you know, in evolutionary terms, within the human race as a whole, the kind of momentum and the impetus of this newly awakened self is building up. So I think it's manifesting itself in many different ways. It's manifesting itself in these kind of transformational experiences in the midst of turmoil. It's manifesting itself in more and more people feeling pulled towards spiritual practices and spiritual paths. Just in general, I think spirituality is probably the fastest growing trend in our culture at the moment. And, it's another way in which it's manifesting itself. I think the question really is whether it can manifest itself fully before, we suffer the consequences of, the kind of discord that we've inflicted on the world for, the last few decades. And, as we said at the beginning, we are living through a time of crisis. And I think the gradual spiritual awakening which is occurring is possibly a reaction to this crisis. And it's certainly a way in which we could heal and transcend the crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. We are caught between the devil and the blue sea at the moment, and of course, what's happening within is also happening without. So, whereas we're speaking largely about our own experiences and the experience of those people that we've held, or in your case, you've examined sounds too distant a word and too detached a word. I'm sure you become very involved with the people that you're working with because you're a kind, sensitive, interested man. You're curious about the human psyche and so forth. But as we know that where we go through meltdown, that also our communities go through meltdown, our cultures go through meltdown. It seems that it's part of a mortal wound that we all have because of the way that we've experienced the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. In other words, that we choose our transformations through desperation rather more than inspiration. And clear the psyche from all of its debris, which of course, as we know, is the pretense of the ego, the glamour of the ego. As we clear this away, that I feel we get to an extraordinary truth about our own experience as lovers of each other, so that we can begin to move forward and create a brave new world that is of a very, very different, where we start choosing inspiration rather than desperation. But it's very raw at the moment. And of course, as we both know, because here we are in the world commenting on it, professionally speaking, but I know we've also shared that this COVID phenomenon is also been an exacerbating force of extraordinary degree because of the way that it's unsettled us into economic uncertainty, as well as the fact that we may be losing our lives. And therefore, I believe that, I've never been so busy, Steve. I'm seeing so many people who are going through an existential crisis. And my job is to hold them in that space with as much love and faith as I can, so that they can feel themselves going through the meltdown, knowing that they're actually in that process developing a totally new hierarchy of values. And the values are all in association with the fact that they are developing their own sovereignty and becoming the master mistresses of their own destiny, rather than being affixed or plugged into a system that drains their energy.
It's certainly, an opportunity for spiritual growth. It's a time of trauma and challenge and crisis. But those things are always opportunities for spiritual growth. Most of us grow through challenge and through stress and crisis. Those are the periods of our life when we undergo most spiritual growth. Because, when life is easy, when life is stable, we tend to live at the surface of our being. We don't draw on our spiritual resources. And if your life is always easy and stable, then you lose touch with the deeper aspects of your being. Not necessarily, but you may lose touch with the deeper aspects of your being. So sometimes when the surface is disrupted, and when you have to go deep inside yourself to find your resilience and your resources to cope, that's when you unearth the spiritual resources that are deep inside you. So I think a lot of people, despite all the difficulties, I think some people are kind of finding those riches within themselves. You know, I think human beings, we always find out that we're stronger than we thought. Whenever we're tested, whenever we're challenged, we only really become aware of how powerful and how resilient we are when we're faced with crises. And, you know, it constantly amazes me that about how strong, how resilient, and how spiritually rich we are inside. And so, you know, that's if there is a positive side of what we're going through, that's one of the positive aspects, I think.
Well, I mean, it's all positive, isn't it? You know, we're all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. It's all positive. I mean, we're all moving towards transcendence. And I hear you loudly and very clearly. But you see, I believe it's to do with a malaise that is caught within the juxtaposition between our psyche and our physicality, you know, which is why I'm so fascinated by our earlier conversation and now this. Because of you're playing with the vital interface between the transpersonal and the psychological, the known aspect of the way that the ego interfaces with the id and the super ego. I find that really fascinating. We know that there are constant parallels of this modern definition, and I speak modern simply in terms of the 20th century, modern perspective academically, with all of the great mystics. And so it seems that historically we have been engaged in this rubber band yo-yo mechanism between the heightened states of pure joy and of despair. And that something vast is happening within us from an evolutionary point of view, which obviously is going to take time. It's not going to all be completed tomorrow, where we actually no longer need to transcend through desperation. We transcend through inspiration, so that we're constantly developing all of this intelligence within ourselves and becoming aware of the cosmological nature. I had a breakthrough just the other day, which I think I talked about last week with the wonderful conversation that I had with Pam Gregory, who's a very, very fine astrologer who came onto Deep Dialogues, that I just seen a quantum physicist who came to me, one of the world's leading quantum physicists, who's finding it very difficult to speak in public, meaning he's not a very good public speaker, meaning that when he's lecturing or when he's speaking at the UN, people are bored by the content of his information. And it's actually not to do with the content of his information. It's to do with the delivery of his information, because it was just very dry and very monolithic. And so I said, well, let's just talk about the poetry of the way that you believe the substance of the universe and or of the cosmos, and how it's represented within the formulaic understandings that you have, which are obviously very profound. So tell me, what do you feel a supernova is? And he launched into an anthem of formulae. So I listened. Most of it was deadly boring, but I listened in and said, okay, that's one way of looking at it. But, you know, from where I'm sitting, I feel that a supernova is a divine orgasm. How do you feel about that? And he burst into peals of laughter. He said, that is the most extraordinary thing, Stuart. So I said, well, but isn't it exciting to think in those terms? And he said, oh, my goodness me. By the time I'd finished, he was revolutionized. And he knew that he needed to go away and find parallels through the great philosophers or through the great poets that he could bring in the way, for example, that Deepak can talk about quantum physics in one, and then in the next breath, he's quoting eons of Rumi.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
So, you know, the very fact that that was happening, I find irresistibly wonderful or wondrous, that God works in mysterious ways his wonders to perform.
Yeah, it illustrates the connection between science and spirituality.
Yeah,
you know, there's sort of a duality is developed between science and spirituality, as if they are two different domains. And the people who live in those domains mistrust each other. There's almost a kind of conflict between them. Yes. Scientists don't want to be spiritual. Spiritual people don't want to be scientific.
Yes.
But you know, but my view and my feeling is that they belong together. That science is spiritual, And spirituality is scientific. They belong together, the two domains. They should be integrated.
Yes. Yes.
You know,
Do you believe in the concept of the superhero?
the superhero, in what sense?
Well, in the East, of course, a superhero is a bodhisattva, meaning
Oh,
a man or a woman who is a living God. It's just that what's interesting when these people step forward, because we believe in their compassion, because we believe in their purity, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, for example, that he can speak quantum physics, perhaps not using the language of a scientist, but he can speak about the cosmology of the human spirit in a way that is completely acceptable to the majority of scientists.
yeah. Well, I think quantum physics in general is interesting, because it is the place where science and spirituality meet. It's the place where materialistic science fades into this strange mystical realm, which doesn't make any kind of rational sense. And it kind of illustrates that in its most essential form, the material world dissolves into spirit. Spirit is the most essential quality of the material world. So I don't think there's a duality between spirituality and materialism. I think materialism is an expression of spirit. The material world stems from spirit. So it's all spirit. Everything is spirit.
I mean, we've come really full circle in our hour, and I know that I have two thoughts that I'd love to bring our conversation to a close, because just in respect of the time frame of your time and the people that are listening in, the wonderful people that are listening in.
You do know that time is an illusion.
Of course, but we organize our lives through this thing.
Unfortunately,
there are social constructs, aren't they, to do with respecting other people.
Yeah.
And of course, this is being broadcast around the world, and we're not all living in this time frame. But I wondered if you had any specific thought that you'd like to share that rounds off the cosmos that we've just journeyed through, the internal and external cosmos.
Maybe could I read a short poem? I was going to express a thought, then I realized I've written a poem to express this thought. So yeah, it's
that was on my next breath.
Oh, okay.
The poem.
Well, this is a short poem. The thought I wanted to express really is that one of the themes that we've expressed during this conversation is the alchemical power of crisis, the alchemical power of loss. So maybe I'd like to remind people that even when we go through difficult periods in our lives, for example, the period of lockdown at the moment, and even though these periods of our lives entail loss or disappointment or failure and so on, there is a transformational underside to all of these experiences. There is a kind of golden transformational core in the midst of the bleakness of these experiences. So these are just a few lines about the power of loss, the transformational power of loss. In every loss, there is liberation. When we're adrift in the future, chasing after goals and ambitions, loss pulls us back to the present. When illusions of success and status have inflated our self-importance, loss returns us to reality. When our minds are full of confused desires, loss disentangles us and simplifies our lives. When there are too many attachments inside us, obscuring our true nature, loss empties out our beings and reconnects us to our essence. Loss breaks down our identity so that our broken fragments can fuse together again at a higher level of order. In loss, we find ourselves again.
Wow. And these two poems are in which anthology? Are they different anthologies?
They're in this book called The Clear Light.
Clear Light.
Yeah.
So everybody, The Clear Light by Steve M. Taylor?
Just Steve Taylor.
Steve Taylor.
Yeah.
Because I know your website is www.stevetaylor.com.
Unfortunately, Steve Taylor is a very common name, so I had to put my middle name in there to differentiate it from other Steve Taylors.
There's only one Steve M. Taylor. Yes. Stewart Pearce is also a very common name, as a very famous footballer. Except
yeah, that's right.
Spelled differently, S-T-U-A-R-T. I'm an S-T-E-W.
Right.
Steve, I mean, I've just thoroughly enjoyed myself. I always love being with you and sharing and hearing these extraordinary perceptions that you have based on this wonderful academic inquiry of your life, but also moving into the metaphysics. And may the metaphysics claim you even more as the journey forward, because I know that there are going to be some wonderful opportunities for you to go even deeper into an explanation of supernature. And it will help us all.
I hope so. That sounds wonderful.
So thank you very, very, very much. And for all of you who have listened in, you've been so patient waiting initially over our technical hitch. Thank you so much for being with us. And later I will be reading all of your comments on the Facebook page. And I just want to mention Steve's, I've already mentioned his website. Are there any particular avenues of activity that you'd like to mention to the people?
Well, if people, if they're interested, they can take a look at my website, which is stephenmtaylor.com. Stephen with a V, M for Mark, stephenmtaylor.com. And there's information about my upcoming events. There's a lot of my poems are on the website. Some of my academic essays, some of my kind of popular writings as well. So there's lots of material on my website if people are interested.
Fantastic, fantastic. Any events coming up online that you're running or want to share?
Yeah, I've got a dialogue with my friend Serge Beddington-Barons on the 2nd of March. I've got a workshop in April, an online workshop. It's almost every month I have something coming up. So,
and I believe that the transcripts of most of your dialogues are on the Facebook page, are they? On your website?
Yeah, I think they're on my website. Yeah, but yeah, I use Facebook quite a lot. So people, I post whenever I write a new poem, I post it on Facebook. Partly just as a means of sort of publishing it, so I don't lose it. I'm sort of, there's always a danger of, if my computer freezes or gets broken down, I might lose a poem. So I always post them on Facebook, so people can follow me on Facebook to read my latest poems.
Wonderful, wonderful. And so, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, and bid you adieu, as I will with this wonderful gentleman. And for those of you who would like to, please go to the YouTube, my YouTube library, and subscribe by clicking on the button or liking the button. And then tag a friend, thumbs up and tag a friend. And also go to my Facebook pages, and we will be meeting again, or I will be meeting again next Monday with the wonderful Robert Holden. Except Robert and I are going to be in pre-record, so it will be shown at this time on Monday evening, but it will be a pre-record. Promise. Robert came on Deep Dialogues at the end of last year, and it was such a resounding success that I said, you must come back. And he said, well, I rarely do this, but for you, Stewart, I will. He's also a man, of course, of the metaphoric consciousness, so he loves writing poetry. So namaste, namaste, and thank you so much for being with me. I hope you can come on again as well. It's been wonderful.
That'd be great. Yeah, thank you, Stewart. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Bless you.